Okay, so I wanted to do a video to go over the California ballot measures from this cycle. I think California had more propositions on its ballot than any other state did, and quite a few of them got national attention, so let's just dive into it. All in all, I was disappointed with California's results, seeing of how blue a state California is. It was kind of surprising to see some of the results pouring in. I mean, I would say a good amount, most of the propositions I was a little bit disappointed on. There was a couple that were good that they passed, or good the way the vote went, but yeah, it wasn't the most uplifting results. So let's just dive into the first one, Prop 14. That was medical research bonds. What that does is that would authorize $5.5 billion in state bonds for stem cell research and other medical research. I voted no on this because that sounds good on the face value, but when you dive into it, about 80% of that 5.5 billion would be going towards property development and building contracts. And of course, the biggest funder of the bill was a very large real estate developer in California. So yeah, most of that 5.5 billion had nothing to do with medical research or stem cell research. But I understand why so far it's too close to call, but it's leaning towards yes with 84% of the vote in. I understand why it's leaning towards yes because people, oftentimes with these propositions, look at the face value or just the basic kind of quick gist of it and then vote based off that. Then Prop 15, the next one, change commercial property tax. This is a very cut and dry one. I'm also, I'm disappointed the way the results are leaning right now, but I'm not surprised either. So what it would do is it would close a loophole on large commercial properties to where they could be taxed based off the purchase price of that property instead of the market value of that price. So... well, and then it would just redirect that money to local governments and schools. I mean, that's all it pretty much was. The way I understood it, a lot of advertising was spent on radio campaigns to kind of, put the word out there like, oh, if you tax big businesses and stuff, somehow your prices will skyrocket, which, that just wasn't true. But anyways, I'm not super surprised at how that vote turned out. But let's get into the Prop 16, which kind of, earned a little more national attention. This was the more controversial one on the ballot this year. This one is a for sure no vote now. It is to essentially bring back an affirmative action type policy, which it wasn't based off of quotas or anything like that. All it would do and all it had access to essentially was it would only come into effect within state contracts or college admittance. So you have counties here or colleges where most of the surrounding community, it could be pretty racially diverse, but then the college itself is majority white. And same with building contracts and stuff. They tend to favor more white-owned businesses or male-owned businesses. So the way I understood it, that I think affirmative action the last time it was in California was sometime in the 80s, and bringing it back would essentially mean that women and minority-owned businesses I think they lost $800 million per year in revenue since they repealed the affirmative action that was in place. So I voted yes on it. I'm not surprised though that it failed and it was a no vote. But again, it would only come in within a matter of state contracts or government or college admittance. And there was no quotas. There was a lot of propaganda run on this about, how there's going to be quotas, how it's going to discriminate against everyone. And the part of it that I want people to acknowledge and, kind of understand with this bill is it was more leaning towards grant preferential treatment towards certain classes. But yeah, that's how the vote fell. I'm not super surprised on that one. Restore former felon vote. This is one of the good votes that passed. It restores voting rights upon completion of a prison term, in that parolee period when someone is being released from prison, which is great that it passed. It passed pretty overwhelmingly, close to 60%. It's kind of almost criminal that a state takes away someone's basic rights, especially after they've completed their prison sentence after they've served their time. I think it's ridiculous that people don't have the right to vote. And then the next one, was one that I was kind of surprised that failed, because I kind of looked at it more as a common sense one. All it would do is it permits 17-year-olds who are going to be 18 by the time of the general election to vote in the primary elections. So obviously, the logic of, if you're going to be 18 and expected to vote in the general election, you should have some electoral power in choosing which candidate you're going to vote for in the general. I mean, that's pretty consistent logic. I was a little shocked that this one failed. This was, like I said, a very common sense measure I thought was on the ballot. So yeah, that's pretty much it. There's not much else to talk about that one. Let's go to Prop 19. That's one that is another one that's too close to call, but so far it's leaning towards yes. This was a very contentious one on the ballot, because what you have to understand about this one is, in 2018 there was a very similar proposition on the ballot without a couple of the provisions. So what I mean by that is, this one, it would allow homeowners over 55, disabled, or victims of wildfire or natural disaster to transfer the tax base that they bought their first residence at, or their primary residence, to a second or replacement residence. And what that would mean is, with Prop 5, like I said, in 2018, I think it was Prop 5, I'm not 100% sure on that, but the measure that was similar like this in 2018 that failed, all it did was it allowed homeowners over 55 to keep the tax base from when they purchased their primary residence, and they could buy a second house and still pay the tax rate that they did on their first house. Obviously, this would have just grown the immense gap of wealth, including just from a sheer base perspective of it, also into generational wealth. Most of California's, a lot of the upper class or upper middle class people in California tend to be over 55, and we have already a huge generational wage gap and stuff. So all this would do is kind of seek to increase that gap. So when that failed, with oftentimes people supporting the ballots that aren't generally good for the public, what they'll do is they'll include certain measures of a moral standard to make it very difficult to vote against. So that's why they included this year disabled or wildfire disaster victims, which obviously those two I completely agree with. If your home was destroyed from a wildfire or natural disaster, or if you are disabled, yes, you should be able to transfer your primary residence's tax credit and tax base over to a second or replacement home. That's pretty obvious. But when they included the provision to allow homeowners over 55, that's where I have the issue with. So this one's leaning towards yes. It's pretty split right now. It's one of the closest votes. Prop 20, this one, I was very thankful that it failed. This was kind of a jump off of California's 3-strike rule that was in place. It wasn't in place, but it was on the ballot a while ago. And it's essentially kind of like far-right criminal and judicial measures that are on the ballot. What this would do is it would add a lot more crimes that were considered misdemeanors and upgrade them to felonies, and then it would add a lot more crimes that could be chargeable as misdemeanors. And what this would also do is, for misdemeanors and stuff, it would establish a statewide DNA database of collection of anyone who, people who committed a misdemeanor crime or felony. That's, obviously very problematic for the future. That's very kind of like an Orwellian sense. I was very thankful this failed. This was overwhelmingly failed. This was a very far right measure on the ballot, supported by I saw a lot of prison and guard unions supporting this. But so Prop 21, this is one I'm not surprised that it failed. I'm just disappointed. This one was it allows local governments to establish rent control on properties that are 15 years or older, which is great. In California, we have a giant housing crisis. I think we have like a quarter or 20% of the nation's homeless population. There's a huge gap of just home ownership in California, or the ability to rent a home. Oftentimes, you could work in California a minimum wage job full-time while having a type of side hustle, and you would be scraping by to afford a horrible studio or 1-bedroom apartment in a bad part of town. That's often the case in California, and it's it's unfortunate that the vote fell this way. I'm just not surprised it did. So Prop 22, that was the one I would say with the most national attention, just because of who was involved in it and the type of companies, and what that would mean for them going forward. So what this would do is it would all this is for. It's very simple. It reclassifies app-based drivers from like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash and stuff. It would reclassify them as employees and not independent contractors. Obviously, the measure that was proposed on the ballot, it was to keep app-based drivers as contractors. So a no vote would reclassify them as employees, and then a yes vote would keep them as independent contractors, which the companies make an immense profit and have a huge benefit in having their entire workforce consist of independent contractors, because then they don't have to do any type of sick leave, they don't have to do any type of vacation time. If there's any damages to the vehicle, they're not liable. If there's any type of overtime, there's no overtime. There's not many, typical benefits that go with a career, which oftentimes drivers in California, it's a lot of them, it's their full-time job. And the one I hate about this is just how much lies people can do over the markets. So when you would see advertisements for it, it would be ads sponsored by the companies saying like, oh, if a yes vote means that it would protect workers and give them sick leave and paid medical leave and health insurance and all these great benefits. But that's just not true. Classifying them as employees would have done that. Keeping them as independent contractors would not have done that. And what you also have to understand about this one is that the state legislature passed a measure saying that these companies have to pay their employees more, not reclassify their employment, just pay them more. They were saying the margin of profit you're making off your employees is a very, very ridiculously high margin, so you're going to have to pay them more. And then the companies, a lot of people saw it when Lyft and Uber started threatening to pull out of California, which it was just completely empty threats. If they pulled out of California, a very, very large chunk of their business would have just been killed immediately. They're, in a sense, reliant on the economy and the market in California, and then if not, another company would have just come and take the place. But they fought paying their employees more, and so then they got this measure to put on the ballot. And so one of the fine prints of this measure that no one really talked about was that it would take essentially democratic and legislative power away from the state, because after this, instead of just needing a regular majority to enact any type of legislation, the state would need a 7/8 supermajority to do anything or legislate over these companies in any way. So essentially it takes away all power from the state and the governmental body in terms of like their employees' pay or legislating over them or anything. So it's very problematic for the future going forward that this passed. This kind of ensured and locked down the system that they had in California of the app-based drivers as independent contractors. And this was also one of the most heavily funded measures on the ballot. I think the companies poured in close to like $250 million. It was ridiculous. I saw ads every single day on this measure. The next one is problematic, not because of what was on it or anything to do with that. It's just problematic based off the healthcare system we have in the United States, not just California. The for-profit healthcare system is very problematic when it comes to dialysis clinic standards, because what this proposal would do is it would require a physician to be on site at all dialysis clinics whenever they're giving treatment to their patients. Except the problem is that physicians are very expensive to hire, and a lot of clinics obviously can't afford to have a full-time physician. So then they would lose a lot of business, and most of the patients would just revert back to like the 3 big hospitals or clinics in the state. The basic problem with it is that we have a for-profit healthcare system. If we didn't, the idea of pay would never have to come up with having a physician on site, because most people, when you ask them, should we have a licensed physician or professional on site when giving treatment? People go, yeah. But the problem is that most of the clinics couldn't afford that, and it would have resulted to a lot more clinics shutting down. So it's just problematic based off the type of healthcare we have in the U.S. That's really all there is to say about it. It was a no vote overwhelmingly. It failed. And that brings me to Prop 24, which this was kind of a shaded and it was very good in disguise essentially, because they guised it as expanding consumer privacy. All it would do is it allowed consumers to prevent businesses from sharing personal information for the use of sale and stuff, except California already has a lot of privacy, consumer privacy laws. All this would do is alter them, instead of where you used to be able to say to companies on a broad scope, do not sell my data for any purpose to other businesses or other people. Now you would have to go to each individual company or website that you may use and individually request through their process for them to not sell your data, instead of just being able to flick a setting on a broad scope. So it passed because of the way they marketed it, and it was under kind of like false pretenses in a way. It's under the guise of expanding consumer privacy. All it does is alter it and puts more of a burden on consumers. So Prop 25 was probably the most disappointing for me, because this one was probably the most complicated too, the most complicated worded on the ballot. This was to approve replacing cash bail. This was similar to Prop 22. The state enacted legislation to essentially ban the cash bail system in the state, and then the bail companies and prison guard unions and stuff immediately started fighting it and got this measure put on the ballot. And so a yes vote would have, it was phrased ridiculously. So on the ballot, I think it said a referendum on SB 10 on whether or not cash bail could exist. So most people just reading that, I had to read it a couple times. Most people just reading the first couple sentences had no idea what a yes or no vote would mean. But so a yes vote would keep the measure that was put forward by the state legislature and passed. It would keep that in place to ban cash bail, and a no vote would keep cash bail in place. So the reason I was most disappointed, I would say, with this is simply because the problems with the cash bail system, it's obviously disgusting that we base off whether you can get out of jail or not awaiting trial. We base that on how much money you have or how much money you have access to getting approved for. And obviously, that's very heavily racialized as well. If you're a white guy awaiting trial, you're much more likely to get approved for bail or be able to just pay the bail versus a minority waiting for trial. That's a very big issue, especially because I think the average bail price in California is set at $50,000. That's utterly ridiculous. But instead, this would shift bail qualifications. Instead of how much money you have to pay or how much you can get qualify to pay us, it would shift it to, is the person a flight risk, or are they a harm to themselves or the community? What was the crime that they were, was it violent or non-violent crime that they're being tried for? Or do they have a history? What kind of history do they have? Is it a violent one? Is it one where they've run from other bails? Whatever. But it would have shifted to a more moral and ethical standards versus fiscal standards for releasing people from jail awaiting trial. So yeah, that one was the most disappointing that it failed, but I don't know why specifically it failed. I didn't see much commercials or markets about it. I think it was just complicated, the way it was worded and stuff. So all in all, like I said, I wasn't that impressed with California's ballot results this year. It's kind of disappointing to see some of them roll in. There was ones that were very good that passed, obviously, like to restore former felon votes. That's great. Or the ban on having a statewide database to collect people's DNA for misdemeanor crimes. That would have been very problematic. So there was just a couple cherry-picked ones I can say were good that the vote fell that way, but the overwhelming majority of it was kind of disappointing. So yeah, that's about the video. If you guys like this video and want to see more, go ahead and drop a like and hit subscribe if you're not already. Thank you for watching, everyone. Peace.